He said she was beneath him, except he didn't. Not exactly. What he actually said was far more interesting, and so was she. The village of Thornfield Crossing had, in its collective opinion, seen quite enough of the world without the world sending a duke. It was the 3rd week of October 1818, and the elm trees along the high street had turned the particular shade of amber that made the village look better than it was. The Coaching Inn, repurposed these 4 years into Fenwick & Sons Publishers and Lending Library, sat at the centre of the high street, with the quiet authority of a building that has decided what it is and will not be persuaded otherwise. Its sign was freshly painted. Its windows were clean. At 7 in the morning, a light was already burning on the upper floor. Margot Fenwick was reading a manuscript she had already decided to publish, which meant she was reading it for the 3rd time, looking for reasons not to. The manuscript was 214 pages, written in a hand that started neat and grew urgent toward the end. Its author was a Mr. Robert Aiken, formerly of Aldenmere, and it covered 20 years of service to one of the older dukedoms in Wiltshire, with the steady, clear-eyed honesty of a man who had nothing left to protect. Margot had received it in August, read it in a single sitting, and spent September arguing with herself about it. The argument had resolved itself, as her arguments tended to in favour of publication. She turned a page. Outside, a cart rattled past on the cobbles. Agnes Holt arrived downstairs. Margot heard the familiar sequence of the door, the bolt, the scrape of the compositing stool, and the day began. By 9 o'clock, Margot had written 2 letters, corrected a proof and been informed by Agnes that a carriage bearing the Aldenmere crest had passed through the village the previous evening. Heading for the Dower House, Agnes said, setting down a tray of type with the care of someone handling small explosives. She was 51, had been with Fenwick & Sons since Thomas's father ran it, and possessed the specific talent of delivering information as though it were merely weather. Is it? Margot did not look up from the proof. Mr. Aldridge at the inn says 3 carriages, staff as well. Someone intends to stay. Someone is welcome to. Margot marked a comma. The Dower House has been empty 7 years. The roof wants attention. The Duke wants something more like. Agnes aligned a row of type with her thumbnail. People with that crest don't come to Thornfield Crossing for the air. Margot set down her pencil. She looked at the manuscript on the corner of her desk, at the neat stack of pages she had read 3 times and intended quite firmly to print. Then she picked up her pencil again. Then he'll find what he's looking for, or he won't, she said. Either way, it's nothing to do with us. Agnes said nothing, which communicated volumes. The subscription assembly was held on the last Friday of every month in the upper room of what had once been the White Hart, and was now, owing to a bequest, a renovation, and the sustained organizational energy of Mrs. Dorothea Pace, the Thornfield Assembly Rooms. The room held 40 people comfortably and 60 with goodwill. On the last Friday of October, it held 53, which meant the goodwill was present, but under strain. Margot attended because she always attended. Half the village subscribed to the lending library. An hour at the assembly once a month kept the press visible and the relationships functional. This was the reasoning she used. She was also privately fond of dancing. She did not advertise this. She arrived at 7:20, in a dress the colour of late autumn moss, with her dark hair arranged by her own hand into something that suggested effort without announcing it. She greeted the people she liked, was civil to the ones she didn't, and accepted a glass of negus from a tray held by Mrs. Pace's youngest son, who was 17 and had been visibly in love with Margot for 6 months. She was kind about it, which she felt was the least she could do. She had been there perhaps 20 minutes when Sebastian Carew, Duke of Aldenmere, entered the room. She knew who he was before he was introduced, because the room did what rooms do when someone important enters. It rearranged itself. Conversations slid sideways. Heads turned with the studied casualness of people pretending not to look. Mrs. Pace materialized at the door with the speed of a woman who had been waiting for exactly this. He was tall, which was the first thing. The room was not large, and he made it feel smaller. He was dressed without ostentation in dark blue, which was either good taste or indifference. He had the kind of face that had probably been handsome at 20 and had since become something more useful. Angular, composed, trained to give very little away. He was accompanied by a narrow, efficient-looking man with a leather document case who could only have been a solicitor. Herr Duke and his solicitor at a village assembly on a Friday evening. Margot took a sip of negus and revised her earlier assessment. Something was definitely wanted. She watched him work the room, or rather permit the room to work him, which was not the same thing. He answered questions with economy. He smiled once at something the vicar said, and it was brief and genuine enough that Margot noticed it was genuine. He kept his solicitor close. She was in conversation with Dr. Hale about a medical pamphlet she was considering when Mrs. Pace descended on them with the bright, inexorable energy of a woman executing a social plan. "Mrs. Fenwick, you must allow me to present His Grace the Duke of Aldenmere. Your Grace, Mrs. Fenwick runs Fenwick and Sons, our publisher and lending library, just at the end of the High Street. Quite the institution." The Duke was mid-sentence with his solicitor. He turned. His eyes moved to Margot with the brief assessing quality of a man who had been introduced to a great many people and had developed efficient methods for categorizing them. "Mrs. Fenwick," he said. "Your Grace." She inclined her head, technically correct for a widow of her station. A flicker of attention crossed his face. "Fenwick and Sons," he said, "the lending library. And the press we publish as well as lend." "I'm aware." The two words had a particular quality. Margot filed this away. "How are you finding the Dower House?" she asked. "It requires work. It's required work for 7 years. The guttering on the East Wing has been a topic of some local interest. That produced something close to a dry look. I imagine it has. Mrs. Pace had been pulled away by an emergency involving the musicians. Dr. Hale had melted into the room. Margot and the Duke stood in a pocket of relative quiet. "I've been in the village 3 days," Margot said. "What brings you to the assembly?" "Courtesy," he said. "One ought to present oneself." "One ought, though most people who come for courtesy stay for dancing. You don't appear to be planning to dance." "I am not." "Then courtesy has its limits," she finished her negus. "I hope you find Thornfield Crossing useful, Your Grace. It generally is for people who know what they're looking for." She returned her glass to a passing tray and moved back into the room, leaving him standing with his solicitor and whatever he had been about to say. She did not hear what he said to Mr. Draper in the 2 minutes that followed her departure. Nobody did, precisely. But the assembly room was small and sound, carried around corners in peculiar ways, and what Mrs. Aldridge heard, or believed she heard, was a sentence that began, "She's the publisher, then. I'd assumed someone more." The sentence did not finish. It didn't matter. The beginning was sufficient. By Saturday morning, the version circulating over breakfast tables was clean, declarative, and thoroughly satisfying as village news. The Duke had looked at Margot Fenwick and said she was beneath him. Margot heard it from Agnes at 8:30, who had heard it from the butcher's boy, who had it from Mrs. Aldridge directly. She listened. She set down her cup. She thought about it for a moment with the same expression she used when reading a proof with a structural problem. Then she laughed, a single genuine sound, and said, "Well, that's not nothing." Agnes watched her. "You're not angry?" "I'm a little curious." Margot picked up her cup again. "He was in the middle of a sentence. What do you imagine came next?" "Something worse, most likely. Or something entirely different," she considered. "It doesn't matter. I'll hear his version eventually. He came here for the manuscript. He'll come to me." Agnes returned to her type after a moment, and when he does, "Then I'll decide what I think of him myself," Margot said, rather than letting Mrs. Aldridge do it for me. "He came on Monday." She had expected him sooner, Sunday perhaps, with the impatience of a man accustomed to things moving when he required them to. But he arrived on Monday morning at 10 o'clock precisely, which told her something. He had thought about how to do this. He had chosen a time that was businesslike rather than urgent. He was not alone. Mr. Draper accompanied him, which was correct and expected. A duke did not call on a tradesman's widow without professional cover. Margot was behind the front counter of the lending library when the bell above the door announced them. She was checking a return, a battered copy of Waverley, whose spine had been cracked by someone who held books incorrectly, and she finished the inspection before she looked up. "Mrs. Fenwick," Sebastian said. "To your Grace, Mr. Draper." She set down Waverley. "Are you a member of the lending library?" A pause. "I am not." "Membership is £1 a quarter. 430 volumes. We've an excellent natural philosophy section, if that's a consideration." "I'm not here for the library." "No," she agreed. "I didn't think you were. Shall we go through?" She led them into the back room, the working heart of the press with its smell of ink and paper and the particular dry warmth of recently set type. The Stanhope press occupied the far wall like a piece of iron theology. Agnes was in the compositing room beyond. Margot pulled out the chairs on the visitor's side of her desk. Mr. Draper took his with the efficiency of a man who had sat in many offices on his employer's behalf and knew how to be useful and unobtrusive simultaneously. Sebastian sat. He looked at the room with a brief, comprehensive survey, then looked at her. "You have a manuscript," he said, "written by a man called Robert Aiken." "I have several. I'm a publisher." "A specific manuscript?" "I do." "I'd like to discuss it." Margot folded her hands on the desk. "Then discuss it." He had prepared for this. "Aiken was in my employ for 20 years. Whatever he's written about the dukedom—" "It's accurate," Margot said. "A beat. You've read it." "Thoroughly. 3 times. It's carefully written. Mr. Aiken is not a vindictive man, and his account is honest. The decisions he describes were made. The conditions existed." She paused. "He admired you for what it's worth." Something moved in Sebastian's expression. He hadn't expected that. "Admiration doesn't preclude damage," he said. "No, neither does truth. But I publish truth. That is the only thing I publish. Fenwick and Sons has a reputation for it, and I intend to maintain that reputation. There are details in that manuscript about the dukedom's finances that are in the past. The dukedom is solvent. The memoir describes a recovery. If anything, it reflects well on your management. It describes my father's failures in explicit terms. Your father died 7 years ago. His failures are historical record." Sebastian's jaw was set. He was holding himself with the controlled stillness of a man who was not going to raise his voice and was paying something for it. Margot found, to her mild discomfort, that she respected this. "Mrs. Fenwick," he said, "I'm asking you not to publish." "I know you are." "I'm prepared." "If you're about to offer me money," she said, "please don't. It would make this conversation unpleasant, and I'm rather enjoying it so far." He stopped. He looked at her, and then, very briefly, he almost laughed. "You're enjoying it," he said. "It's an interesting problem. I have a manuscript that deserves to be read. You have reasons you'd prefer it wasn't. Neither of us is entirely wrong. That's the interesting part. I am asking you as a courtesy, before this becomes something else." "And what does it become if I decline?" "I have solicitors." He did not look at Draper. He didn't need to. "So you arrived with one, I noticed." She tilted her head. "Here is what I'll offer you, which is more than you came here expecting. Read it again. Tell me what, specifically, causes you concern. If there is something false, I'll remove it. If there is something that constitutes genuine harm rather than mere discomfort, we can discuss it. But I won't suppress it because it's inconvenient." He was quiet for a moment. The press through the wall made its patient rhythmic sound. "You're not going to make this easy," he said. "No, but I'll make it fair." She stood, which ended the meeting. "Come back when you've read it properly. Bring Mr. Draper if that's most comfortable. We'll talk then." He stood. He picked up his hat. At the door he paused. She thought for a moment he was going to say something about Friday, about the sentence that hadn't finished. But he didn't. He put on his hat and left. Mr. Draper followed with a brief, neutral nod that contained, Margot thought, the faintest warmth of professional approval. She stood in the press room and listened to the library bell settle into silence. Agnes appeared in the compositing room doorway. "Well," she said. "He'll be back Wednesday," Margot said. "Thursday at the latest." Agnes looked at the door. "He's going to be a problem." Margot sat back down and picked up her pencil. "Most interesting things are," she said, and returned to her proof. He came back on Wednesday, again with Draper, again at 10 o'clock. He set the manuscript on her desk and sat without preamble, having decided between Monday and Wednesday not to waste time on formality. "Page 47, he said. "The account of the Reeton farm evictions. Aiken describes the decision as mine." "It was yours." "It was legally necessary. 3 families had not paid rent in—" "He says that. He's very clear it was legally necessary. He also says you visited each family before the order was enforced and arranged the 2 eldest children's apprenticeships in Marlborough." She paused. "I thought that was rather a good detail. It complicates you." Sebastian looked at her. "It complicates me. As a figure. You're not a villain in this account. You're something more interesting. A man who does difficult things carefully. That's harder to dismiss." She turned several pages. "What else?" He had marked 6 passages. They went through them methodically, Margot reading each aloud, Sebastian making his case, Margot responding with the precision of someone who had read the text enough times to know it better than he did. 2 of his concerns were legitimate. One passage contained a specific figure Aiken had misremembered, and one described a private conversation Aiken could only have partially heard. "I'll write to Aiken and confirm," she said. "If the figures are wrong, they'll be corrected before print. The conversation, if it's speculative rather than witnessed, I'll cut it." She looked up. "The rest stands." He had his hand flat on the desk, looking at the marked manuscript with the expression of a man who had come prepared for a fight and found something more exhausting. A fair interlocutor. "You're going to publish it," he said. "Not a question anymore." "I am." He was quiet. Outside, the high street conducted its Wednesday business. "My father was not a careful man," he said, "and I have spent 13 years being careful on his behalf. This," he touched the manuscript lightly, "is a record of the mess I inherited. I don't object to the record. I object to the conversation it will begin. Every creditor, every county family who wonders whether Aldenmere is sound—" "Will read that it was not sound," Margot said, "and that you made it sound. That is the story in these pages. I'm not certain why you're afraid of it." "I'm not afraid of it." "No, I don't think you are, actually." She folded her hands. "I think you're afraid of being seen trying. There's a difference." The silence that followed was substantial. Sebastian picked up his hat. "You mentioned at the assembly that I'd find what I was looking for." "I did." "I wonder now if you knew then." "That you'd come about the manuscript. Agnes told me a duke had arrived Thursday. You were at the assembly Friday. It was a reasonable inference." She paused. "What I didn't know was whether you'd be worth talking to." He held her gaze for a moment. "And?" "Jury's still out," she said pleasantly. "Good day, Your Grace." He left. Agnes appeared. She had developed a talent for hovering on the far side of the compositing room door at critical moments. "Well?" Agnes said. "He's coming back," Margot said. "He just doesn't know it yet." By the second week of November, Thornfield Crossing had fixed its collective attention on the question of the Duke's continued presence. He had not left. This was in itself remarkable. The Dower House had received workmen. The guttering on the east wing was repaired. Mr. Draper had been seen at the land agent's office twice. The Duke had returned to Fenwick and Sons on 3 further occasions, always with Draper, always at business-like hours, always with the manuscript as professional pretext. What the village observed with most interest was not the visits themselves but their quality. The Duke of Aldenmere was not a man who lingered, and yet he lingered. The inciting remark came to a head on a Thursday, because Thursday was when the Assembly Committee met in the back room of the White Hart, the part of the building Mrs. Pace had not yet successfully reclaimed, and because Mrs. Aldridge was on the committee, and because Margot had been asked to attend regarding a subscription renewal that required her signature. She arrived at 4, signed the document, accepted tea, and was preparing to leave when Mrs. Pace said, "And I do think, Mrs. Fenwick, that you've been very gracious about the Duke's remark. Some women would have been quite cut up." The room held 5 people. All of them watched Margot with the attention of people who had been waiting for this moment. Margot set down her teacup. "I should tell you," she said, "that I'm not certain what the Duke actually said." "Mrs. Aldridge heard it very clearly," said Mrs. Pace. "Mrs. Aldridge heard the beginning of a sentence. That's a different thing." She picked up her gloves. "I've found His Grace to be a precise man. I doubt he left a sentence unfinished without a reason." She left before the room could formulate a response. Walking back to the press in the November cold, she thought about the sentence. She's the publisher then, I'd assumed someone more. More what? It had been sitting with her for 3 weeks, not because she believed the circulated version, but because she didn't know the real one, and she disliked not knowing things rather more than she'd admitted to Agnes. She was behind the counter when the library bell rang, and Sebastian came in, with Draper, as always, who took a seat near the window with the practiced discretion of a solicitor who knows when his presence is technical rather than necessary. Sebastian returned a volume on drainage systems and reached for the next selection, browsing the shelves with the familiarity of someone who had worked out where things were. She watched him take down 2 volumes, read the titles, put one back. "What did you mean to say?" she asked. He turned. "I beg your pardon?" "At the assembly. She's the publisher then. I'd assumed someone more, and then you were interrupted." She held his membership card. "Someone more what?" He was very still. "The version that circulated was that you found me beneath you," she said. "I don't believe that's what you meant. It's not your register. But I'd like to know what you did mean." A long pause. The library was quiet. The press beyond the wall made its rhythmic sound. "More established," he said at last. "I knew the press had been running since your father-in-law's time. I'd assumed—" He stopped. "I'd assumed a man, or an older woman, a widow of a certain age and manner. You were younger than I expected, and less—" He stopped again. "Less what?" she said. "Less formidable," he said, with the flat honesty of a man who had been precise for so long that imprecision had become its own kind of accuracy. I was surprised. I didn't finish the sentence because I didn't know how to finish it without being either condescending or honest, and I'd only just met you." Margot looked at the membership card in her hand. She wrote the return date in the logbook. "That's considerably more interesting than what Mrs. Aldridge heard," she said. "I should have corrected the story when it started." "You didn't know it had started until it was already going." She looked up. "For what it's worth, I didn't believe the circulated version. Not because I thought well of you particularly, just because it wasn't your kind of cruelty." "You've identified my kind of cruelty. Precise and occasionally dismissive by default rather than intent. That's different from contempt." She held out the 2 volumes he'd chosen. "You left one on the shelf." "I wasn't certain it was appropriate." "What was it?" He reached back and produced it, Sense and Sensibility, the 2nd edition. Margot looked at it. She looked at him. She said nothing because there was nothing useful to say. "Keep it," she said. "It's overdue for a reread." He left with the novel under his arm and the drainage volume in his hand. Draper followed, offering Margot a nod that was, she thought, fractionally warmer than professional neutrality required. Agnes appeared the moment the door closed. "I wasn't listening," she said. "You were absolutely listening. He's reading Austen." "Don't," Margot said. "I'm only—" "Agnes." Agnes pressed her lips together with considerable effort. After a moment through the doorway, "The guttering is repaired." "Note it somewhere else," Margot said, and returned to the logbook. She told herself firmly that a man who borrowed novels was still a duke with a compromised estate, and a social position that required a financial match. She believed this for approximately 4 minutes. The manuscript moved between them like a third party in the negotiation. She wrote to Robert Aiken in Devonshire, and they corresponded 3 times about the revisions. The figure on page 47 had indeed been misremembered. The simile on page 112, "The estate accounts lay before me like a battlefield after the smoke has cleared," was revised to something cleaner at Margot's suggestion, which she conveyed through her letter to Aiken as editorial counsel rather than the Duke's objection, because she was a professional and Aiken was her author. On the 3rd Thursday of November, Margot handed Sebastian the corrected pages across the desk. Draper had excused himself to the land agent's office on an errand of his own, the first time the visits had not been 3-person, and Sebastian read in the visitor's chair in silence while Margot worked on a pamphlet commission. He read for 40 minutes. The press made its sounds. When he reached the last page, he set the manuscript down and looked at the ceiling. "It's good," he said. "The writing." "It is." "He's fair, more than fair." A pause. "He liked the work, you can tell. He writes about the recovery as something worth being part of." Margot set down her pencil. "Is that why you dismissed him?" Sebastian looked at her. "I dismissed him for financial reasons. A consolidation, 3 staff positions were eliminated, including the one that had known you longest." He said nothing. "I'm not reproaching you," Margot said. "The decision is documented and the reasoning is documented, and I believe both. I'm noting that it must be strange to read, to be known that clearly by someone you let go." Sebastian put on his hat. He stood slowly and picked up the manuscript. "I'll return this tomorrow." "Keep it. I have the original and the corrected copy." He looked at the manuscript in his hand. He looked at her. He seemed to be on the edge of something. Then he put the manuscript under his arm and left. Agnes at the window watched him walk away up the high street. "He's going to be worse than a problem," she said. Margot looked at the door. "Yes," she said, with the tone of a woman who had already known this and had not found a way to care about it as much as she should. "I think he probably is." December arrived in Wiltshire with cold purpose. The visits to the press continued. Draper accompanied Sebastian less frequently as December wore on, a gradual shift that neither Margot nor Sebastian commented on, and which Draper managed with the tact of a man who understood his role was to make things professionally possible, and then, when no longer needed for that purpose, to become invisible. Sebastian would arrive mid-morning. Margot would be working. He would sit in the visitor's chair and read, or review the corrected manuscript pages she passed him, or argue with her about something in the newspaper, which she received 2 days late from Swindon, and read cover to cover before he was permitted to have it. Agnes had stopped commenting. This was, in its own way, the sharpest commentary available. The press was preparing the manuscript for print. Margot had set a publication date in early February and was working back from it with the systematic satisfaction of a woman who understood production timelines by instinct as much as calculation. The type was being set in sections. The front matter was drafted, the dedication page, for 20 years of faithful service. Celestine had been composed in a typeface she chose carefully, because typefaces were arguments and she knew it. Sebastian saw the dedication page and looked at it for a long time without speaking. "He wanted to dedicate it to you," Margot said, not looking up. "Aiken. His first letter suggested it. I talked him out of it." "Why?" "Because it would have made the memoir about your relationship with him, and it's about the dukedom." She finally looked up. "Also because I suspected you'd find it either embarrassing or moving, and both would have been inconvenient." "Which was it?" he asked. "Both," she said, and returned to her work. He had begun to talk by December, in the way that people talk when they've run out of reasons not to. Not about feelings, he was some way from that, but about the dukedom in terms that were specific and honest and clearly rarely spoken aloud, about his father, who had been charming and financially catastrophic, and whom Sebastian had loved, with the specific grief of a son who has spent years cleaning up someone else's mess. About 13 years of repair, the accounts, the tenants, the particular loneliness of a position that placed you above everyone and made you peers with no one. Margot listened. She did not offer comfort. She didn't think he wanted it. But she asked questions, which was a form of taking him seriously he had not been offered often. "You said once that you wanted to be a barrister," she said one morning, while Agnes was at the binders and they were alone. "I said I was good at argument." "You said both." He folded the newspaper along its crease. "I was 19 when my father died. The argument about what I wanted was already irrelevant." "What would you have argued about?" The question surprised him. She could see it. Not because it was impertinent, but because no one had asked the second question. They'd taken the first answer and stopped. "Property law," he said. "Entail, specifically. The way inheritance works in this country, there are arguments to be made about the distribution of obligations and the rights of those who work the land versus those who inherit title to it." Margot set down her pencil. "You're describing the subject of 3 pieces I've published in the last 2 years. He looked at her. "I know. I read them. They're in the lending library." A pause. "The one on copyhold tenure is the best of the 3. That one made the Earl of Pemberton write me a very aggrieved letter." "I imagine it did." I wrote back, "I imagine that was worse." He didn't respond a second time. Sebastian looked at her, with the expression she had seen occasionally, the one that had depth to it and care, and something that sat between attention and admiration. "Mrs. Fenwick," he said. "Your Grace, I came here to suppress a book." His voice was dry, careful, almost amused. "I've ended up reading Austen and arguing about copyhold tenure. I don't know what to do with that." "Read the next Austen," she said. "We have Emma." He looked at her for another moment and then smiled, not the brief, polite assembly smile. An actual smile, wry and considerably warmer than everything that had preceded it. Margot looked back at her work, because looking at it directly for too long was inadvisable. "Emma," he said, "right." She heard him move to the library shelves. She did not watch him find it. "Mrs. Fenwick," he said from the library. Your shelving system is eccentric. Alphabetical by subject, then by title within subject. It makes perfect sense. It makes sense to you. That's not the same thing. Come back when you've finished Emma," she said, "and we can argue about it." She heard the library bell. The doorway was empty. She sat in the quiet of the back room and thought about the inventory she had been running privately for the past 6 weeks. The careful accounting of a woman who did not allow herself to be mistaken about things. The inventory contained a man who read carefully and admitted when he was wrong and made jokes so dry you had to look twice to catch them. A man who had spent 13 years being correct and was exhausted by it. Against this, a duke who needed to marry money. An estate that was solvent but not secure. The social reality that a duke marrying a village widow with a print shop would be understood, across every drawing room in the county, as an eccentricity at best and a scandal at worst, and that the scandal would land harder on her than on him, because it always did. Both of these things were true. Both would continue to be true. Margot picked up her pencil and returned to the proof. It was Agnes who named it, on a Wednesday afternoon in mid-December when the press was quiet and the light was failing early. "You like him?" Agnes said. Not as an accusation, as a fact delivered in the compositor's register, precise, neutral, without inflection. Margot read a letter from a printer in Bath. He's interesting company. You like him? Margot set the letter down. It's irrelevant. That's not a contradiction. No, Margot agreed. It's not. She folded the letter. He needs a significant fortune to secure the dukedom, a match the county will accept, a family with standing, or at the very least money enough to overlook the absence of it. I have a publishing house with good prospects and no capital. She shook her head. It's irrelevant. Agnes set a piece of type. You could tell him. Tell him what? That I find his conversation excellent and his company unexpectedly agreeable, and that none of it matters because the arithmetic is impossible? She shook her head. That would be unkind. To both of us. Agnes was quiet for a moment. He comes here every day. He comes here about the manuscript. The manuscript is finished. It goes to press in 6 weeks. Agnes looked at her. He comes here, Margot. Margot did not have an answer for this. She picked up the Bath letter and found she couldn't concentrate on it. What would you have me do, she said, and it came out quieter than she intended. I'd have you stop pretending it's arithmetic, Agnes said and returned to her type. Margot sat with this for the rest of the afternoon. That night she read the manuscript she already knew by heart, in the light of her bedroom candle, the wind off the Wiltshire plain pressing against the glass. She turned to the final pages, where Aiken's hand had grown urgent. He had written, "A dukedom, I came to understand in my years of service, is not the man who holds it. But if the man is good, and I believed in the end that this one was, the two become very difficult to separate." She read the sentence twice. She put out the candle. The last week before Christmas brought the Pace family dinner, nominally a subscription committee gathering, actually a Christmas party for anyone Mrs. Pace had decided deserved one. Margot arrived with a bottle of Madeira and her best wool shawl. Sebastian was there, which she had not known, and which produced the specific interior rearrangement that occurs when a person who occupies a great deal of your thinking steps suddenly into physical space. He saw her at the same moment, a mutual acknowledgement, there you are, that both of them would have denied if asked. They moved in adjacent orbits for the first hour. This had the quality of a choreography that neither had designed and both were enacting. She talked to the vicar, to Dr. Hale about his new baby, to Mrs. Pace about subscription numbers. He found her at the bookshelf. Mrs. Pace had one in the drawing room, more decorative than functional. "She has 2 copies of the same Johnson dictionary," Sebastian said beside her. "I've been trying to work out whether it's an accident or a statement for 3 years. Margot tilted her head at the shelf. "Have you finished, Emma?" "Last week." "And?" "Knightley is right more often than he's likable, which is Austen's point, I think. Being correct is not the same as being good company." Margot looked at the shelf. "No," she said, "it's not." A pause. The room was warm around them. "I've been thinking about February," Sebastian said. "The publication and after." He was looking at the shelf. "Draper has identified a potential match. A family in Wiltshire. The connection is not a love match, it is a financial one, and he presented it as a practical consideration." He stopped. "I haven't pursued it." Margot kept her eyes on Johnson's dictionary. "I see. I'm telling you because—" He stopped. The fire across the room made its quiet sound. "It's sensible," Margot said. Her voice was level. "An estate in recovery needs a sound foundation." "Yes," he said, "it is sensible." They stood at the bookshelf for another moment. "Margot," he said. The first time he had used her name, she felt it as a shift in pressure, something about to arrive. She turned. He was looking at her with the expression she had been carefully not examining, attention and depth and the particular quality of a man who has found something he cannot stop reaching for and knows very well that he should. "I should go and speak to Mrs. Pace," she said. It came out steady. "Margot—" "Good evening, Your Grace." She picked up her wineglass and moved back into the room. She spoke to Mrs. Pace for 10 minutes about the New Year assembly and heard nothing that was said. She left at 9 o'clock. Sebastian was in conversation with Dr. Hale and did not look at her as she went. She walked home in the December cold and thought about Agnes saying, "Stop pretending it's arithmetic." She let herself into the press. She went upstairs. She did not light the candle for a long time. She sat at her bedroom window and looked at the high street. Empty, cold, entirely Thornfield Crossing. Entirely hers. She thought about his voice saying her name for the first time. Then she lit the candle, opened the manuscript and read until she was tired enough to sleep. The morning after the pace dinner, Sebastian did not come to the press. Margot noticed this the way you notice a sound stopping, not dramatically, just as an absence where a presence had been. She worked through the morning, set 2 pages of proof, wrote a letter to the bath printer, and did not look at the visitor's chair. Agnes did not comment. This was its own form of commentary. He came the following morning, which was a Friday, and arrived at 10 o'clock as though nothing had changed. He hung his coat. He sat. He asked about the bath paper commission. Margot told him. He listened. They did not discuss the bookshelf or what had been said beside it, or the name that had been used once and not again. This was, she told herself, the correct resolution. They had a professional relationship with the pleasant quality of friendship. The manuscript was 6 weeks from publication. He would be here for that, and then, most likely, not here, because the dower house was assessed, and there was a sensible match identified, and a solicitor who had presented it as a practical consideration. She was good at holding 2 truths at once. She had been doing so for 6 weeks. The letter arrived on a Monday. It was addressed to Fenwick and Sons, from a firm of London solicitors Margot did not recognize. The language was precise and weightless in the manner of correspondence that intends to threaten without being actionable. The substance, a client, unnamed but identified by reference to certain property in Wiltshire, held that the forthcoming publication of a memoir constituted a libel against his family and his late father's name, and that publication would be met with proceedings accordingly. The firm requested that Fenwick and Sons cease preparation pending review. Margot read it twice. She set it on her desk. She went to the compositing room and said, "Agnes, can you manage the next section without me this morning?" Agnes looked at her face. "Yes," she said without asking. Margot put on her coat. She could not go to the dower house. That much was clear. A widow calling alone at a duke's private residence was not done, and would hand the village a story considerably more damaging than the memoir. She sent a note instead, by way of Mrs. Holt's boy, who ran errands for the press and was discreet in the way of boys who are paid to be. "Your Grace, a matter of business requires your attention at Fenwick and Sons at your earliest convenience." Mrs. Fenwick. He arrived within the hour. He came with Draper, which was correct and expected, and Draper sat in his usual chair by the window with his document case on his knee, and the expression of a man who already knew the subject and had prepared for it. Margot set the letter on the desk. Sebastian read it. He set it down. "You instructed this," she said. "I instructed Draper to explore legal avenues. After 6 weeks of coming to this press, after reading the corrected pages," she kept her voice even, "after telling me the prose was occasionally vivid, the letter is a professional step. It is not an instruction to destroy the press or harm you personally. It is a threat of libel proceedings against an honest account." She looked at him directly. "Robert Aiken is 71 years old. This is the account of his life's work. You know this." "I know it." "Then why?" Sebastian sat with the particular stillness of a man who had made a decision in a cold room late at night and was facing it now in daylight. "Because I have obligations," he said, "and because the last 6 weeks have—" He stopped. Margot waited. "Made me forget them," he said, briefly, "and I cannot afford to forget them." "So you reminded yourself with a libel threat?" "Yes." The word was flat and honest, and she was furious with him for the honesty of it. "The memoir contains nothing libelous," she said. "Your solicitors will know that within a week of proper review. The letter buys you time, and costs Aiken anxiety, and costs me money I will have to spend on counsel." She folded her hands on the desk. "It is a bully's move from a man I did not think was a bully." Something crossed his face, a flinch quickly controlled. "It is a practical move." "It is cowardly," she said, and said it cleanly, not as an insult but as a verdict. "You have legitimate concerns about specific passages. We addressed them. The corrected manuscript is honest and fair. You know this, and rather than accept that the world will read an honest account of your inheritance and find it creditable, you are using your resources to delay and intimidate." She looked at him steadily. "I expected better." He said nothing. He was looking at the desk. "Withdraw the letter," she said. Draper by the window was very still. "If I withdraw it," Sebastian said quietly, "there is no longer a professional reason to be here. No manuscript to review, no—" He stopped. "I have not been coming to this press for the manuscript, Margot. Not for 4 weeks." The room was very quiet. "You said there was a match identified," she said. "A family in Wiltshire." Draper mentioned a possibility. "I have not pursued it." "But you will." He met her eyes. "I don't know what I will do. I know what I should do. I have known what I should do for 13 years, and I have done it." He exhaled, slowly. "And I am standing in this room telling you that I used legal correspondence as a reason to remain in proximity to you, and I am aware that this does not reflect particularly well on me." Margot looked at him. She thought about useful and true and the distance between them. She thought about Agnes, who had told her to stop pretending it was arithmetic. "What would you choose," she said, "if the dukedom did not require you to choose for it?" He looked at her with the expression of a man who had been asked this question his whole life and had never once permitted himself to answer it. "I think you know," he said. "I want to hear you say it." A long pause. The press through the wall. The cold December light through the front windows. "You," he said, without deliberation, which is remarkable because I deliberate about everything. He looked at her. "I would come to this press every morning and argue about copyhold tenure and read Austen, and I would choose you." Margot held his gaze. She let the words settle. "Then, withdraw the letter," she said. "Write to your solicitors now by way of Mr. Draper. I won't have a libel threat on my press while we discuss the rest of it." Draper opened his document case without being asked. Sebastian looked at Margot for a moment. Then he sat at her desk. She pushed the inkwell toward him without comment and wrote the instruction. 4 sentences. He gave it to Draper, who folded it, sealed it with professional efficiency, and excused himself to arrange its dispatch. The door closed behind him. They were alone in the press room for the first time in 2 months. "The rest of it," Sebastian said. "Yes?" Margot sat. "Tell me what the dukedom actually needs. Not the catastrophe version, the real numbers." He was quiet for a moment, ordering it. "The estate is solvent. The debts my father accumulated are cleared. The land is productive and the tenants are... things are better." A pause. "What remains is the house. Aldenmere itself. The north wing is structurally compromised and requires capital I don't currently have. What does the repair cost?" He told her. It was a large figure, and he said it without embarrassment, which she respected. "Can it be staged?" she asked. "Over 10 years. If the estate income holds no bad harvests and I stop spending on the dower property, the certainty is lower, but it's possible." "So a well-connected match is a faster solution," Margot said carefully. "Not the only solution." "Correct." They sat with this. The fire in the grate had burned low. "I have no capital," Margot said. "The press is solvent and it's growing. In 5 years it will be genuinely profitable. But now, no, I cannot fund a wing." She met his eyes. "So this is still impossible on paper?" "Yes," he said, "it is still impossible on paper. I spent 6 weeks building a reason to be here," she said, "and then tried to stop the very thing that justified it." "Yes." "That is a very thorough way to be miserable." Something moved in his face, the almost laugh she had seen only once before. "I've had practice." Sebastian. She used his name the way he had used hers, as a statement. She saw him register it. "What do you want to do? Not what makes sense. What do you want?" He looked at her for a long time. "I want to stop making every decision in service of the title and nothing else." Each word placed with care. "I want to come to this press in the morning. I want to argue about things that matter. I want..." He stopped. "I want to be chosen rather than inherited. I want to choose." Margot looked at him. "Then let's start there," she said, "and work out the rest." He did not kiss her. She had been ready to make a decision about whether it was advisable, and it didn't happen, which turned out to be the correct choice, because what did happen was better. He sat opposite her, and they talked for 2 hours, about the North Wing and the estate income and the 5-year projection for the press, and what Fenwick and Sons might become if it had room to grow. The conversation was entirely practical, and entirely something else, and both of them knew it. She walked back to the village at 1 o'clock. The frost had softened, the road was cleaner. Agnes was at the compositing desk. She looked up. "The letter is withdrawn," Margot said. "We're on schedule for February." Agnes looked at her face. "And the rest?" "The rest is still complicated." Margot took off her coat. "But it's honest now, which is a start." Agnes set a piece of type with a small, precise click. "Good," she said. January in Thornfield Crossing was the village's least performative month. Christmas was discharged, the assembly rooms were quiet until February, and the high street contracted to its essential self, The smithy, the butcher, the apothecary, and Fenwick and Sons, whose lamplight burned later than any other establishment. Sebastian came every morning. This was now neither disguised nor remarked upon, not to their faces at any rate, though Margot was not under any illusion about the village's views. Draper had stopped accompanying him on most visits, his professional cover having served its purpose. What remained was simply the fact of it. The Duke of Aldenmere came to the press and sat in the visitor's chair, and stayed. She had stopped telling herself it was only the manuscript. The arithmetic had not changed. He needed capital for the North Wing. She had none. The county would find the connection irregular at best. A duke and a village printer was not the kind of match that passed without remark, and the remark would settle more heavily on her than on him, as these things always did. These facts were as true in January as they had been in October. What had changed was that both of them had stopped pretending the facts were sufficient. The manuscript went to press on the 14th of January, which was a Thursday. Margot pulled the lever on the first printed sheet herself, as she always did on a first run. The press made its decisive sound. She lifted the sheet and held it to the window light, the title page, clean and clear. 20 Years at Aldenmere, A Memoir of Service, by Robert Aiken. She held it for a moment. Then she passed it to Sebastian without comment. He took it. He read the title page. He read the dedication. He turned to the first page of text and read the opening paragraph, which she knew by heart. I came to Aldenmere in the year of my 30th birthday, in service to a family I had not yet learned to read, and left it in my 51st with a clearer understanding of estates, of men, and of what 20 years of witness does to the one who watches. He folded the sheet carefully along the print lines and put it in his coat pocket. "You can have a bound copy when they're ready," she said. "I know." He looked at the press. "I want this one." Agnes, inking the next form, did not look up. The run took 3 days. Margot and Agnes worked in long stretches, printing and hanging sheets to dry in the back room with the focused, physical satisfaction of people making something real. Sebastian came and sat and read. On the second day, he held a sheet flat without being asked while Agnes checked the impression. He did it without comment, which meant he understood that commentary would be unwelcome, and the work itself was what mattered. On the third evening, when the last sheet was hung and the press was cleaned and Agnes had gone home, Margot opened the bottle of wine she kept for print completions. "Aiken will receive his copies by the end of the week," she said. "He'll be pleased." "Is he well?" "His letters suggest so. He has a garden in Devon he's very attached to." She handed Sebastian a glass. "He asked after you, whether you'd been in correspondence." Sebastian looked at his glass. "I haven't written to him." "You should." "I dismissed him." "You did. And he wrote 20 years of honest service into 200 pages and called you good." She looked at him. "Write to him, Sebastian." "What would I say?" "That you read it, that it's accurate and fair, that the simile on page 112 needed cutting." A pause. He'd pretend to be offended, and he'd appreciate it. Sebastian turned his glass in his hand. He had the expression of a man confronting something he had been deferring, not from cowardice, but from the particular paralysis of people who feel things deeply and have trained themselves not to. "He served my father and then he served me," Sebastian said slowly. "The first service was probably easier. My father was charming and impractical. I am—" He paused. "Neither. You're exacting and occasionally impossible to work for, and you argue well and you notice things," Margot said. Aiken noticed all of that. He considered it worth 20 years. She looked at him directly. "Write to him." Sebastian looked at her for a moment, with the open expression she had learned to read, the one that was not the Duke, the one that had been there all along under the architecture of duty. "You are—" He stopped. "Don't," she said. "I was going to say formidable." "I know, don't." She set down her glass. "I know what I am. I'd rather know what you are. You know what I am. I know what the dukedom requires you to be. I've read 214 pages on the subject." She looked at him. "That's not the same thing." He set down his glass. He looked at her across the table, the ink cloth, the compositor's measure, the press cooling through the wall, and said, "I am a man who has been in this room every day for 2 months and cannot imagine not being in it." Margot looked at him. "I know what the arithmetic says," he continued, voice steady and quiet. "I know Draper's view of the situation. I know what is sensible. I have been sensible for 13 years, and I am—" He exhaled. I am finished with it as a governing principle. Sebastian, she said carefully, what are you saying? I'm saying that I want to stop leaving at 4 o'clock. I want to stop pretending this is about a manuscript. He looked at her. I want to ask you something, and I want you to answer without accounting for what is practical. Margot folded her hands on the table. Ask, she said. Do you want this? He gestured between them, not at the room, not at the press, between them, honestly, not as arithmetic. She held his gaze. She thought about Thomas, a decent man she had been fond of and not been in love with, and had spent 4 years being quietly sorry about. She thought about the press and the library, and the life she had built alone and meant to keep. She thought about the inventory she had been running since October. Yes, she said, honestly and without accounting for practicality, yes. He looked at her as though she had handed him something he had expected to be refused. Then she said, now we account for practicality. He almost laughed. Yes, we do. I'm not going to pretend the problem doesn't exist because we've admitted to the thing underneath it. She kept her voice even. You need capital for the North Wing. I have none. The county will find this connection irregular. That is the mildest word available. It is. And the irregularity settles harder on me than on you. You understand that? He met her eyes steadily. I understand it. So, she looked at him. What actually happens if you do not make the sensible match? Walk me through it. Not the catastrophe. The actual version. He considered with the slow, systematic care she had come to know as his. The North Wing repair is deferred. 10 years most likely if the estate income holds. The main rooms are sufficient in the interim. Aldenmere functions. It is simply not restored to its full extent. A pause. The county families will talk. My mother will be aggrieved. My sister is 17 and will need launching in 2 years. There is a possibility the connection affects her prospects. Is your sister charming? Margot asked. He looked briefly surprised. Exceptionally. Then she has her own agency in the matter. Old family, quick mind, exceptional manner. She will do well regardless of whether her brother made a conventional match. That is her story to write, not a liability of yours. She paused. Your mother's grievances are a separate concern from the estate. Sebastian looked at her. Something very close to amusement crossed his face. You're resolving my family. I'm applying logic to what you've included in your ledger that isn't actually a ledger item. She looked at him squarely. The North Wing is the real constraint. Your family's opinions are not. He was quiet for a moment. And the press, he said, 5 years to profitability. Real profitability. It already covers its costs. He looked at the table, thinking, the slow, systematic working she had watched since October. If Fenwick & Sons becomes what it could be in 5 years, it does not solve the wing, but it changes the picture. It won't solve the wing, she agreed. No, but I find I cannot make myself care about that the way I should. He looked at her. Which is either evidence that I have lost my reason or that I have, for the first time in 13 years, found it. Margot sat back in her chair. She looked at the hanging printed sheets, the press, the room she had made her own. This is still a worse arrangement on paper than the sensible alternative, she said. Yes. The county will talk. Yes. Your mother will write letters. My mother, Sebastian said, dry as February, writes letters about most things. I have long since stopped governing my decisions by them. Margot looked at him. She thought about Agnes. Stop pretending it's arithmetic. She thought about 214 pages about a man who did difficult things carefully and was, in the end, worth 20 years. All right, she said. He was very still. All right? The arithmetic is poor and the North Wing will wait, and the county will find us interesting, and none of that... She stopped. She looked at him clearly. None of that is larger than this. He reached across the table and took her hand. The same quiet deliberateness as always. No performance in it. Just the certain steadiness of a man who had finally stopped managing the distance between what he wanted and what he did. I should tell you, he said, that I have wanted to do this since approximately the 3rd week of November. That was 6 weeks ago. Yes. You managed 6 weeks. I'm very controlled. You are, she said. It's been maddening. But she turned her hand in his and held it back. The memoir was published on Monday, the 1st of February, which meant Margot had been at the press since 6 in the morning, when the first box of bound copies arrived from the binders at 11 o'clock. She opened the box herself. She lifted out the top copy and looked at it, The plain cover, the clean title, the spine she had chosen with care, and felt the specific private satisfaction she felt at every publication and which no one else would entirely understand. She handed the second copy to Sebastian, who turned it in his hands with an expression she could not immediately read. "Send the first to Aiken," he said. "I always send the first to the author." "I know." He looked at the copy in his hands. "I wrote to him last week." She looked at him. "What did you say?" "That I'd read the memoir, that it was accurate and fair." A pause. "That the simile on page 112 had been rightly cut." "Did he respond?" Sebastian reached into his coat and produced a letter. "This morning." He held it out. She didn't take it. "What did he say?" "That I was still exacting and occasionally impossible, and that he would have stayed 20 more years if asked." He looked at the letter. "And that the woman running that press was clearly the best news to come out of Thornfield Crossing since the lending library opened." Margot blinked. "He said that." He wrote, "I imagine she gives you an argument worth having. Good arguments are rarer than good harvests, Your Grace. Hold on to them." He folded the letter. He had been informed of recent developments by his niece, who is apparently Mrs. Aldridge's cousin. "Of course she is," Mo said. "This village." "This village," Sebastian agreed with the particular warmth she had watched come forward since October, the warmth that was not the Duke and had always been there underneath. Agnes was at the compositing desk, setting type for the next commission, a pamphlet on agricultural improvement, which a certain Duke had recently offered to review, with the serene expression of a person whose predictions have been entirely confirmed. "Agnes," Margot said. "You knew?" "I suspected," Agnes said with dignity, "from approximately the second week. You said he was going to be a problem." "I said worse than a problem." She set a piece of type with the deliberate precision of someone landing a final point. "I was right." Margot looked at Sebastian, who was looking at the bound memoir in his hands. The copy he had asked for, the one he intended to keep. "And where will you put it?" she asked. "The shelf at Aldenmere, between the estate accounts and the drainage reports." He looked up. "I'd like you to see where that is." She looked at him. "Come on Thursday," he said. "My housekeeper will be present throughout, everything proper." A pause. "I want you to see the house, Margot." He had been careful about this. She knew it had cost him something to frame it correctly, to offer it in a form that the village could not turn into something damaging. It was precisely his kind of care, the kind that looked like formality and was actually protection. "Thursday," she said. The New Year Assembly, rescheduled to February on account of weather, was held on the Friday of the first week of the month, which meant that most of Thornfield Crossing was present when the Duke of Aldenmere arrived with Mrs. Fenwick, spoke to the vicar, accepted negus from Mrs. Pace's youngest son without condescension, and danced. He danced well. This surprised no one who had looked at him properly, and surprised everyone who had only looked at the title. Margot danced opposite him in the first set, with the enjoyment of a woman who had always been fond of dancing and had spent too long attending assemblies for professional reasons. The set was lively. She made no attempt to pretend otherwise. "You're better at this than you let on," she said during a figure. "I've been letting on very little for quite some time. I noticed approximately the third week of October. They separated for the next figure, came back together. What did you notice?" he said. "That you were careful about everything except your own interests." She turned. "And that your interests were quite clear, even when you were pretending they weren't. To you, perhaps. And to Agnes, and I suspect to Mr. Draper." He considered this. "Draper has said nothing." "Draper is loyal and tactful. He's also extremely observant." A pause. "He approves for what it's worth." "How do you know?" "He came to renew your library membership last Tuesday. He said, and I am quoting exactly, 'His Grace has spoken more in the last 3 months than in the previous 3 years, and the subjects have been substantially more interesting.'" Sebastian looked at her. The warmth in his face was entirely unguarded. "Draper has been with me since the beginning," he said. "He is accustomed to a particular version of me." "And what version is this?" He turned her in the figure, his hand at her back with the light. Certain pressure of a man who knows where he is and is glad of it. "A better one," he said quietly. "I think." The set ended. The room applauded. Mrs. Pace was seen to say something to Mrs. Aldridge with an expression of complete vindication. The vicar refilled his glass. Agnes, who had come as Margot's guest and was standing near the door, accepted a glass of negus and permitted herself a small private smile. Margot stood beside Sebastian in the warm, crowded room. He handed her a glass. They stood together in the easy quiet of people who have found their way to each other by the longest possible route and are prepared now to stay. "You should know," she said, "that I intend to publish 3 more books this year. The pamphlet on agricultural improvement, a volume of natural history essays, and a second printing of the Aiken memoir. The first run sold out in a week." Sebastian turned to look at her. "It's sold out." "Entirely. 3 London booksellers have written." She kept her expression even. "It turns out people are very interested in honest accounts of how estates are run, particularly estates that recover." He was quiet for a moment, holding this with the full weight he gave everything that mattered. "The North Wing," he said. "Stays deferred," she said. "But the press in 5 years, Sebastian. This is the beginning of what it becomes." He looked at her, with the open expression that was not the Duke and never had been, the one that had been coming forward since October, since the first walk, since the first time he had read something she'd printed and told her honestly what he thought. "We'll do the East Room first," he said. "When the time comes, my grandmother had it as a sitting room. Good light." "I haven't seen the house." "No." A pause. "You should." "I should," she agreed. "I've been walking past your grandmother's kitchen garden for 4 years. The rosemary will want cutting back in March," he said, "if it's to keep producing. I know several good uses for rosemary." "I thought you might." He looked at her with the quiet certainty of a man who has stopped managing the distance between what he wants and what he does. "I'll want your advice on it. Regularly." "I'll be here," she said, and meant it in every way that counted. Across the room, Agnes did not look up from her negus. She didn't need to. On Thursday, Margot walked past the old kitchen garden and through the Dower House gate for the first time, up the gravel to the front door, which opened before she reached it. The housekeeper took her coat. The hallway was plain and high-ceilinged, with the quality of a house that had been closed for years and was becoming cautiously itself again. There were fresh flowers on the hall table, not a professional arrangement, she thought, chosen and placed with the self-conscious care of someone trying. Sebastian came downstairs. He led her through the house with the quiet attention of a man showing someone something that mattered to him, pointing out the estate records room, the library, the long corridor that connected the main house to the east wing. The housekeeper moved at a proper distance throughout, present and discreet. The east room was long and south-facing, its windows looking over the old kitchen garden, the escaped rosemary, the self-seeded fennel, the good bones of what his grandmother had planted. Margot stood at the window and looked at the garden she had been passing for 4 years from the other side. "It looks different from here," she said. "Everything does." He was behind her at the correct distance. "The shelf is there." She turned. The bookshelf ran along the interior wall, estate accounts, drainage reports, land surveys in a row, and the Aiken memoir standing among them in its plain cover, spine outward. She looked at it for a moment. Then she looked at him. He was watching her with the open expression she had catalogued since October. Not the Duke, the man underneath, the one who had wanted to be a barrister and had spent 13 years being correct, and had walked into her press to suppress a book, and found instead something he had not expected and did not intend to give up. "I should tell you," he said, "that I haven't thanked you." "For what?" "For not suppressing the memoir when you could have, for making it worth reading." He held her gaze. "For not letting me leave." "You always had a choice to leave," she said. "I know." A pause. "That was rather the point." She looked at the room, the good light, the long windows, the garden below, the shelf with the memoir standing between estate accounts and drainage reports, exactly where it belonged. She looked at him. "The rosemary," she said. "March, you said." "If you're willing." "I'm willing," she said. He crossed the room, not dramatically, simply with the same quiet deliberateness he brought to everything, and offered her his hand the way he had in the press room, without performance, just the certain steadiness of a man who had finally stopped managing the distance. She took it. Outside, the elm trees along the bridle path stood bare and patient, and entirely indifferent to the county's opinion. Inside, Margot Fenwick, widow, publisher, woman who had been taking accurate inventory since October, closed the ledger on useful versus true, and chose true, and found that it balanced after all. The rosemary was cut back on a Tuesday, which meant Margot was on Dower property with her sleeves rolled and her hands smelling of bruised herb, and Sebastian was holding a basket with the expression of a man who had not anticipated this being part of the morning and had no objection to it. The housekeeper was visible through the kitchen window. This was noted by neither of them, and observed by both. "You're taking too much off the left side," Sebastian said. "I'm taking exactly the right amount off the left side. It will grow unevenly. It will grow back." She stood, pushed a loose strand of hair off her face with her wrist, and looked at the bush with the assessing expression she used on manuscripts. "There, that's done." He looked at the basket. "That's a great deal of rosemary. Agnes uses it, and Mrs. Holt, and I intend to send some to Aiken. He wrote that his Devon garden is mostly decorative, and he misses useful plants." She stripped a last stem and added it to the basket. He also wrote that he expects an invitation. "To what?" Margot looked at him. He looked at her. The kitchen garden was very quiet. "He's an optimistic man," she said. "He's a perceptive one." Sebastian set down the basket. He had been working towards something since they arrived that morning. She had known it since the gate, and she had been waiting with the patience of a woman who had learned that he arrived at things in his own time and was worth waiting for. "I wrote to my mother," he said. "And?" She was aggrieved. A pause. She then wrote a second letter, which was less aggrieved, and a third, which was almost civil. My sister wrote separately to say she thought it was, her word, splendid, and that she intends to visit in April and read everything in the lending library. Margot considered this. She sounds like good company. She is when she isn't being exhausting. He looked at the rosemary. "I also spoke with Draper." "I assumed you had. He has drawn up the relevant documents. The settlements are modest by the usual standard. There is no pretending otherwise." He looked at her directly. "He wanted me to be certain you were aware that the arrangement is not, that I am not, Sebastian, bringing a great deal to this in material terms, and that a woman of independent means ought to, Sebastian." He stopped. "I run a printing press," she said. "I'm acquainted with modest settlements and material realities, and I have been managing my own affairs for 4 years without assistance." She looked at him steadily. "What Draper wants you to be certain I understand is not something I require Draper to explain to me." A pause. "No," he said, "I didn't think so." "Good." She picked up the basket. "Was there something you wanted to ask me, or were you planning to have Draper do that as well?" He looked at her. Then, with the quiet, unhurried deliberateness that was entirely his, no performance, no grandeur, just the certain steadiness she had come to know as the truest thing about him, he said, "Will you marry me?" Not a question, quite. A statement offered for her consideration. Which was, she thought, exactly right. Margot looked at the basket of rosemary in her hands. She looked at the kitchen garden, the good bones, the things that had survived being left alone and were better for the attention. She looked at him. "Yes," she said, obviously. Something crossed his face that was not quite relief and not quite joy, but was the particular expression of a man who has been carrying a weight for a very long time and has just, at last, set it down. He took the basket from her. Their hands were briefly in the same space, smelling of rosemary and cold March air. "Aiken will want a full account," he said. "Aiken will have to be satisfied with an invitation," she said. "I'm a publisher, not a correspondent." They walked back toward the house. The housekeeper had moved away from the kitchen window with the tact of a woman who had seen enough. Above the bridle path, the elm trees were just beginning in their patient way to consider spring.